So, good evening. Welcome to Bridging Minds. I'm Kamal, your host, and here we'll explore many historical and contemporary themes that veer a little off the beaten path with the aim of building bridges of understanding and wisdom. So, grab some popcorn, and if you like what you hear, please press the subscribe button and enjoy the content. So, today we have Professor Richard B. Spence. He's an American historian and professor associated with the University of Idaho Department of History, where he's instructed since 1986. And Professor Spence specializes in military and espionage history and is a subject expert on the history of Russian intelligence and other such esoteric and eldritch topics. So in addition to many articles for scholarly journals, Professor Spence is the author of Boris Savinkov, Renegade on the Left, I'm sorry. Trust No One, The Secret World of Sidney Reilly, Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence and the Occult, and more recently, 2017's opus, Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, 1905 to 1925. Professor Spence has a PhD in history from the University of California at Santa Barbara, and he's with us tonight. So thank you for joining us.
Hey, pleased to be here.
Pleased to have
So I guess the only thing I could add to that is last year I did retire from the University of Idaho. So I'm retired at this point. So I don't work for them anymore.
Right.
So, but you know, you work for a place for 34 years, you get kind of used to it. So yeah, I'm retired and I'm doing some other things now. I guess if I could throw in a couple of plugs for things, a lot of my current work has been for an outfit called the Great Courses, which offers, you know, non-academic courses in a huge variety of subjects. The two that I've done is The Real History of Secret Societies, and another one which recently came out called Crimes of the Century, A Selective History of Infamy. And I'm currently working on another 24-part series called Secrets of the Occult. So that's what's keeping me busy these days.
Right. Sounds like you have a lot on your plate.
More than you would think. You know, you think when you retire, things get simpler, but not always the case.
Especially if you have areas of strange fascination, our strange interest. So, oh, that's thank you for sharing that. And I'm definitely going to look into your great courses offerings that are available. So, yeah, so one of the things you mentioned that you're doing research and more into the history of the occult currently. And what I find interesting is that the world of the occult and the world of espionage often seems to touch together in history in very interesting ways. I guess they both often concern secrets, secret knowledge, things of that nature. But I'm curious, what are some of the things that initially inspired your interest in military history, your interest in the history of espionage and intelligence, and then from there, your interest in the history of the occult?
Well, I guess you could say that military history segues into intelligence history because intelligence, espionage is another form of warfare. Or you could argue in some ways it's a substitute for warfare, but it's all part of a contest between nation states.
Right.
And then espionage or intelligence segues into the occult because what they have in common is this obsession with secrecy. So it goes back to the whole, you know, what does the term occult actually mean? So it's one of the things you always have to set out to do in looking at anything is to define your terms. Okay, what you know, for instance, if you're talking about a conspiracy, okay, what is that? Rather than the popular way people think about it, what does that actually mean in legal terms or in practical terms?
Right. What does it mean to conspire?
Well, yeah,
conspiracy.
A conspiracy, my definition of it is simply two or more people working in secret to attain a common goal. That's all it is. You got to have, one person can't conspire. You have to have at least two.
Right.
And I mean, that's basically taken from the definition of a criminal conspiracy,
Right.
which is two people working in secret to carry out a criminal, but it doesn't have to be criminal. There's nothing that says conspiracies have to be involved in criminal activity.
Right.
It simply has to be something that a small group of people do without the awareness or input of anyone else.
Right.
Once you sort of get that basic definition, then you realize that this stuff is everywhere. I mean, a large part of what it is that people do is involved in essentially, practically speaking, conspiratorial activity.
Back to high school, I guess.
High school is, like I've said, if you're ever with a group of people and you're going to go do something and somebody said, do we have to bring Bob along? And you decide, okay, well, let's not tell Bob. All right. Well, you've just entered into a conspiracy against Bob. They're not going to be invited and they'll never really figure out why.
Right.
So it tends to be just the way that human beings operate in many ways. So if you go to something like a cult, the term occult just means hidden. Oh, it means hidden from view. You can't see it.
Right.
And so that itself, that simple definition has different meanings. Part of what a spy is supposed to do, if you're operating as an intelligence agent, no one's supposed to know you're a spy, right? That's supposed to be kept hidden. What you're really doing is, if you're a deep cover agent living in a foreign country, running an intelligence cell, then what you do must remain hidden. That is, it is an occult activity.
Right.
So usually what we commonly associate a cult with is we associate it with stuff which is spooky and diabolical. Okay, so when you say a cult, the first thing people think of is, well, devil worshippers. There we go. There's some sort of cult of devil worshippers, and they're all dancing around a cauldron, sacrificing babies. All right, that's well, that can be, because you'd have to keep that hidden, but it actually covers a much broader area. So much of what is involved in intelligence work must of necessity be kept secret or occult. And in the same way, in the realm of what we tend to think of the traditional occult, it's all about guarding certain rituals, procedures. Everything there tends to operate around this idea that only need to know is the assumption. So in the intelligence realm, you never tell anybody anything unless they need to know that. And unless they've been read into it, unless there's some particular reason for someone to have it, you don't share more information than is absolutely necessary. In an occult society, you think that you basically have a handle on some kind of esoteric knowledge, right? You know something that other people don't have. And notice that one of the things you tend to find typical of people who would call themselves occultists is that they seldom go out and advertise this to everybody. So I've discovered the secrets of life and death. Here's what they are. No. I have the secrets of alchemy. No. I mean, you can see this historically in alchemy, which is really just chemistry, with chemistry with magical intent. But everything alchemists did was to conceal part of it's just concealing trade secrets.
Right.
And one example I guess I could give is that modern day stage magicians, people who we know are performing tricks. Right. This, consciously we're aware. This is a person who's performing a trick.
Right.
So there's nothing supernatural about it. But one of the things that magicians are very, very careful about is guarding the secrets of those tricks, preserving the illusion of what they're doing. Because it's actually a mimicry of what could be called real magic. These are people who are sort of pretending to work magic, but they're doing it through these carefully crafted tricks. Right. But in order to maintain that illusion, you can't know how the trick works, because the moment you do, you see it. And that's then destroyed.
Right.
So, it also sort of combines in, I think, in the history of actual occultism or real magic, where a lot of what people are doing are tricks. And there's always this element of charlatanism, of trickery, of something pretending, let's see, taking on the sort of, you know, veil of the supernatural, or really being this kind of clever guys. And those two things are always sort of combined together in a way that a person from the outside can never tell the difference. So it's a kind of trade. You know, intelligence has a thing called tradecraft. It's all the tricks you use to keep what you're doing secret. And the occult has tradecraft, all the various things you do to keep your knowledge, rituals, or procedures secret. So there's this, they just sort of meet, they segue together, and they have much the same kind of mindset.
In a sense, they're both, I guess the term clandestine would also definitely apply as well. That it's occulted, it's hidden. This involves occulted tradecraft and trade secrets that are kept hidden from the general population, but known, I guess you would say, only to I guess like an initiated.
Initiation is a very important part of it. You know, if you go into an intelligence agency, if you work your way through the CIA, KGB, you're initiated at certain levels. And keep in mind, the one thing that you were repeatedly told as you go through there is you keep your mouth shut, right? You don't tell people what you do. You don't tell them where you're going. Lying becomes absolutely necessary. And not only, you know, just day-to-day lying, you have to be quite good at it. You have to have a convincing, you know, again, if you're going to go in as a resident illegal agent operating in a foreign country, you have to have what the Russians would call a legend. You have to have a backstory.
Right.
And that backstory is the identity you're operating under. And it's not just a name, there's a whole history to this person. So you would have to remember what your parents' names were, what your pet was when you were 5 years old, all the places where you lived, the schools you went to, the people you knew. So just like your real life, any question someone could ask you, you would have a ready answer for. You would know where this person you're pretending to be was at any particular time. But it's all a lie. You know, again, it's part of this trick, which you're using to become someone else.
So in a sense, I mean, hear a little bit of feedback, oddly enough. In a sense, I guess being successful in the world of espionage would require a similar skill set as an actor.
Yeah.
Thespian, yeah. But you're playing a role, and you have to know this role inside and out. You have to know your lines, your character's motivations, in a sense.
Yeah, I guess it's similar to that. I mean, I have no background in acting. My wife has some. And so one of the things that, you know, again, if you're going to play a character in a film, you have the backstory of the character. You have to know, you know, what kind of a childhood did this person have? Did they get along? You know, what are the key events that made that character the person they are now? Otherwise, you really don't have anything. You just have, you know, if someone just gives you a name, you know, you're now John Smith and you're supposed to be this person, then it's kind of up to you to fill in the blanks. Whereas otherwise, you're given this whole kind of character, this whole sort of mapped out person. There's another meaning, though, when you're looking at the term occult, which particularly applies to occultists, and that's the idea of the occult related to a larger hidden world. So the one thing that most occult belief systems have is the idea, and this, by the way, goes into the whole subject of religion, which, you know, this will probably annoy some people or sound blasphemous, but religion is occultism. It's just official occultism. Because effectively you believe in the same thing. Well, you believe If you believe in God or gods, if you believe in any type of higher intelligent power,
Mhm.
you're believing in something which you cannot see, but which you believe exists in or around you in some other state of being.
Right.
That is, the common view in this is that the world we live in, our physical reality, is only part of a larger reality.
Mhm.
Our world is just a subset of a much larger world.
Mhm.
And that makes sense because our whole perception of our world is limited by our senses.
Right.
But it doesn't take too much experimentation to figure out that there are things out there that our senses can't perceive. So
Right.
we can only perceive a certain range of color. That's it.
Mhm.
But we know that that spectrum keeps going.
Right. It's much wider.
It's much wider. There are sounds, your dog will show you that there are sounds that they can hear that you can't hear.
Right.
I mean, that's an interesting thing to keep in mind is that your pet lives in a different world than you do.
That's true. Cats,
So
for
yeah,
example, they seem to inhabit a completely different reality.
I think that's part of it. I think
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons that we can communicate with them on a certain level, but on another level, they're really living in a parallel universe.
Yeah.
And they're living in a parallel universe in which a lot of the colors that we can see don't exist, and all kinds of
Mhm.
sounds and smells. For dogs, the whole world is full of smells.
Right.
Yeah, we can kind of, human beings aren't very good sniffers. We can sort of catch a few things, but smell doesn't play a big part in our world, and it plays a huge part in theirs. So it's an interesting way of thinking of it is that, the animal that's sitting on your lap or next to you
Mhm.
is simultaneously living in a separate world, a different world than the one that you're in.
Hmm.
And so there's this concept there's this reality that we can't see, but which on some level, arguably, we sense is there.
Right.
Possibly, one argument is that we actually have other senses. We don't know quite what they are. The type of thing that we call gut instinct.
Intuition, things of that nature.
Intuition, something seems wrong about this situation, something seems right about the situation. You don't know quite what it is,
Mhm.
but it's one of the earliest things that you find. And it's this sense that there's this larger world, and furthermore, that this larger world is inhabited, that there is some
Right.
sort of consciousness which exists there and which interacts with us,
Mhm.
and which in simplest term is constantly messing with us. Okay, there are things out there
Right.
messing with us all the time,
Yeah. So looking
and
at us.
we get little examples of this when too many coincidences show up.
Mhm.
Other kind of indications, and it gets, and for us, for human beings, it gets spooky very quickly
Mm.
because we really don't know what we're dealing with. And if you think about it, I basically argue simply that all religious systems are a way of interpreting, of trying to give a name,
Mhm.
a kind of face, or an organization to this larger hidden world. Or, this is
Mhm.
who's there and this is what they want.
Right.
So nobody can quite agree upon that, but what they all agree upon is that there's somebody out there and they want something.
It's a much larger world than what we perceive. And while we may have different labels for that larger world or different categorizations, it's still a way of dealing with the larger world that I guess your point is it's largely occulted to us. We can't perceive it. We think it's there, we perceive it's there, we feel it's there, or we believe it's there, but we have no direct sensory perception of it.
And it can be beneficial or it can be malevolent. It's always trying to, this is why you get this. The other thing you'll tend to find pretty much universally is that there's a hidden world and it's inhabited by good spirits and bad spirits.
Mhm.
Okay, you can go from there and you can call some of them gods, goddesses, whatever you want to do. But there are good spirits and there are bad spirits. So there are intelligence out there that can be helpful and beneficial, and there are others that can be harmful or even deadly. Or are they the same ones in different moods? I don't really know. And it's one of the common thing that you'll often get across cultures is that there's always some sort of trickster. Okay, every sort of system always has some sort of, there's some sort of being which is has a sense of a good joke that they'll play on humans, really likes messing with us. But on the other hand, can be, if they're in the right mood, or I don't know, if you kill a goat and offer it to them, that they'll help you in some respects. And so if you tend to look, I think, at a lot of human behavior and religions, that's what we're always trying to do. We're trying to figure out what it is that these things want and how we can appease them and how we can get them to help us.
Right.
And you just begin to try all kinds of things. So that's this the sense of an occult reality, which systems of occult knowledge or purported occult knowledge, that's what they're trying to discover, and that's what they're trying to systematize in some way.
Right. That's interesting. It's I can see the overlaps for sure. There's a lot of conspiracy theory, particularly in the last 25 to 30 years, on the theme of, okay, well, we have elites, they do things in secret, so they're occult elites. Intelligence agencies are run by governments, which are our rulers, so by definition, they're elites. So you have these occult organizations, in a certain manner of speaking, doing occult hidden things in the literal sense of the term. It's occult hidden, dealing with a hidden world outside of the normal world of civilian perception, and we don't know what they're doing. The Washington Post tells us sometimes, or we think they tell us, but we don't really know.
Well, you have interesting questions. I mean, do governments run intelligence agencies, or do intelligence agencies run governments? Who's actually in control?
Right.
So, one of the terms that's gained some popularity, I guess, in recent decades, is the term of the deep state.
Yeah.
Or in some cases, the kind of permanent government.
And cryptocracy is another term I've seen very recently pop up in the last few years.
It comes down to this question: who's actually in control of things? And it's an interesting question. I think the term deep state first was used to refer to modern Turkish politics.
Yeah,
that's where it originated, and for very good reason. If you look at if you look at the history of Turkey since the 1920s, what you find is ostensibly a republic, right? There's, Ataturk created the Turkish Republic,
right.
And it had, eventually one political party. Then, Ataturk supposedly one day called his fellows in and said, look, we need to be, look more democratic. So on this side of the room, you're now another political party than the other on the side of the room. And that's pretty much the way it was created. But you have different political parties and you have elections. But if you look at modern Turkish history, you'll figure out that the people who actually run things, the bottom line, was the army.
Yeah.
So you can find 3 different occasions from about 1960 on through the 70s and the 80s where the Turkish army just didn't like the way an election went. It didn't like the way what they elected, and they just moved. They had a coup, including a thing called a coup by memorandum, which is interesting, where you don't actually take anybody out of the barracks. You just send a note to the civil government going, we're having a coup, right? So, we can either go through with the whole thing or you can just resign now, which is what they did.
What a choice.
So the idea here was that the Turkish Republic wasn't really a republic. It was just it was a military dictatorship that allowed democratic, republican institutions to function to the extent that they didn't do anything the army didn't like.
Yes.
And has to do with this idea. Look, I've had people who've and they weren't working for intelligence agencies, but they were long-term federal government employees. Someone who spent 25, 30 years working their way up through the GS levels ranks in different agencies. And more than one of them has expressed to me in private is that, it doesn't really matter to me who the president is or what party is in power, because the agency just continues to do our own thing. And the guy's going, I've worked here for 30 years, and I've seen presidents and parties and congresses come and go. Right? The only thing that's really significant to us is that they continue to vote appropriations that keep the agency going, and we're paid. But we actually have no particular loyalty to any of these people. They're short timers. Right. And every president, one of them said, is just a short timer. This person is there for at most 8 years. Right? I'm going to be there my whole career. Right. So there's no way that I would invest a great deal of attention or loyalty to someone who's just going to come and go and then pass on to something else. And their view was that the real government is the vast bureaucratic structure that just operates 24/7 all the time, which performs all of these basic tasks. And it's not the politicians who think they're in control, but are really there just to keep the gravy train going.
Sort of Terry Gilliam's Brazil. The Terry Gilliam's film Brazil from the early 80s.
Yeah.
And a similar theme is this omnipresent, bureaucratic, panoptic organization that just sort of ran things. And of course, they were always monkeying things up here and there. But it was this vision, this sort of, the term dystopian is so overused these days now, but it really was this amusingly dystopian vision of rule by bureaucracy just run amok. And I could see that idea of a deep state. Like I don't know much about Turkish politics. I have a few Turkish friends. I look forward someday to visiting Turkey. I've always wanted to visit Istanbul, but from what I've heard from them, very similar thing. It seems to be common knowledge that the army just runs things, and you have this Kemalist old guard is committed to this ideology of Kemal Ataturk, and maybe some of the younger ones, there's some differences, but at the end of the day, the idea is, well, if there's a civilian government in place, it's because they want it to be in place, and when they don't want it to be in place, they kind of get rid of it and put someone else there, something like that.
Yeah, it's the army is, Kemal Ataturk was a military officer. He was an Ottoman military officer, and then he essentially became the commander-in-chief of the Turkish nationalist forces that won a war against Greece and established an independent Turkey. So the whole country, and this is true for most countries, are founded by these kind of military elites. It's interesting to think of how many countries can you find, including the United States of America, where the ruling elite didn't basically shoot its way into power. Same thing happened in the 1780s.
Right.
Nobody likes to talk about that, but the whole Continental Congress and the Continental Army. All right, if you can put it more modern terms, you could call it, the American Colonial Liberation Front. Okay, okay. They had a political organization, but really it was a military organization. And they fought a war with the colonial occupiers, and eventually the colonial occupiers cut a deal and they left. And now you had this new military and political elite,
right,
which was pretty much the old colonial elite, keep in mind. And they proclaimed themselves the new government.
Meet the
And
old
notice
boss and the new boss.
they never held a referendum as to whether or not anybody was okay with that, right?
This is true.
It's just that the new group of people with guns have replaced the old group of people with guns, and now we're collecting the taxes. So that's, and if you look at the sort of history of revolutions, in the Third World or everywhere else, they all follow the same sort of pattern. You get a militant. Usually, it's a military movement which has a kind of political aspect to it, and they wage a military struggle, short or protracted, and if they succeed, they become the new power. And then they don't want to share power with anybody.
This is really a theme that goes throughout modern history. You mentioned that. I can't think of. Go ahead.
You're going to Algeria. I mean, Algeria is the perfect case. All right, you got the FLN, right? The FLN took power from the French in a protracted war, and the FLN is still in power, right? The army still runs the country.
Right.
Even when there's a civil war to try to uproot them, and all the sort of horrors that Algeria went through in the 1990s. But it's
very tragic.
Yeah.
Bouteflika, the previous president, just went out. I think they're on their second president after Bouteflika, if I remember correctly. But it's still the FLN. Yeah. It's a republic, Republican structure. You have elections, but it's very interesting that one power has managed to, one Freudian slip there, one party has managed to maintain power since the days of Ben Bella.
Yeah, because they think it's theirs. I mean, they created it. This whole state is ours. It was our movement which did this, and therefore it's they can't conceive of an Algeria without them. In the same way that the Kemalist military can't conceive of a Turkish Republic without them.
Or India and the Congress Party, although that's changed now with the BJP rapidly gaining an immense amount of power within the last couple of decades. But it was the Congress Party, they really were the revolutionary elites who they were saying, okay, well, we kicked the Raj out, we sent Britain home, and this is ours. I guess you could say in a certain sense. That makes me that brings up something interesting, what you said about a deep state. It makes me think of the Okhrana, the Tsarist secret police, the Tsarist intelligence organization that just sort of spanned Europe near the end of the 19th and the early 20th century. And I guess in a sense, you could see the Okhrana. Well, first of all, as a specialist in Russian military history, am I pronouncing it correctly? Okhrana?
Okhrana, sometimes they'll call it Okhranka.
Okranka.
You'll see it that way. It'll have a K-A at the end. But Okhrana. Russia's kind of strange with its pronunciation of O's. Usually they come out more like English A's. Okay. But the Okhrana just basically, I mean, the interesting thing is that, an actual bureaucratic entity called the Okhrana never really existed. It's just a term of convenience for what were actually two different agencies that function together in this sort of symbiotic way. And what you actually have, what the Okhrana was composed of. So the Okhrana comes into being in 1881, roughly. I mean, in the early 1880s, there are earlier permutations. And it was all a response to the assassination in 1881 of Tsar Alexander II. And so Tsar Alexander II was, he's generally known historically as the Tsar Liberator. And he was, he was one of the most important, probably the single most important reformer in 19th century Russia and in much of the whole history. And of course, this is one of the things when you start carrying out reforms, there are people who don't like the reforms that you're carrying out, but then there are also the people who don't believe the reforms you carried out were enough. And there was no way he was ever going to satisfy those groups. So what happened was he was assassinated by a early revolutionary conspiracy, a group called the People's Will. It was one of these groups, you'll find them later, who always have this idea that if we can just kill enough people at the top, if we can kill the czar, then the whole rotten system will collapse.
Makes perfect sense. Just kill them all and it'll just sort itself out.
Yeah, well, because that's what they sort of see. The state seems to be composed of the czar and all of his ministers and the various other provincial, there's this governing structure.
Mm-hmm.
So if we just whack enough of these people, then it will disappear. The government will disappear. And of course, they never really get it because those people there's the whole structure of the state. There are the ministries and the people serve within them and the military. There's this much larger state, which isn't going to disappear if you kill the czar. Right. All that's going to happen if you kill the czar is you're just going to get another czar, which is what happened. So you killed Alexander II, who was, on the whole, a reasonable, reform-minded, I'd argue fairly decent human being.
Right.
And you replaced him with his son, Alexander III, who is none of those things. Okay, so Alexander III comes in, and his whole goal is to roll back as many of those reforms as possible.
Right.
That's one of those things that illustrates in a way what is supposedly an old Russian proverb, and I'm not really sure it is, but we'll pretend that it is. And it goes, change only makes things worse. Okay. Things aren't very good, so we're going to change things, and this tends to happen a lot. We're going to make an improvement about something, and well, now we just have more problems to deal with. And the general reason for that is another thing that you can call the law of unintended consequences.
Mm-hmm.
We humans are always dealing with the law of unintended consequences, which means that basically, if you set out to change a particular variable, you will unknowingly alter all of the other variables that are connected to that. So you can never just change one thing. You eliminate this, you then open opportunities for other things, so you never really get the result that you planned on. You get unanticipated changes that, maybe they'll be beneficial or maybe they'll be horrible. You just never really know.
Right.
And it's an interesting thing to look at is that the whole pageant of human history, or whatever you want to call it, is just constantly people trying to deal with the law of unintended consequences. Doing things, hoping to get one result, but never quite managing. It always turns out some way differently than what you assumed you were going to do.
Right.
So the revolutionaries, the People's Will, who killed Alexander III, did not make things better for themselves or anything else. But what it did was to create this, the state suddenly felt that it was under attack. The Tsar has been killed. Mm-hmm. So Alexander III was completely down with the idea of creating a much more systematized, much more modernized security system. This was now going to be state security. And the Okhrana was basically composed of two things. One was the Department of Police. And the Department of Police was a civil organization, not military. Its officials were all civilian bureaucrats. And they essentially were the investigative, analytic, and archiving part of the organization. So the headquarters of the Department of Police was in St. Petersburg, the imperial capital. And this is where all the information that was gathered flowed. And this was where the general directives came out of it. But the other half of this organization was a thing called the Special Corps of Gendarmes.
Yeah,
The Special Corps of Gendarmes were paramilitary. They actually held military ranks and they were uniformed officials. And these were the guys who actually ran what were called the special offices, the OOs that existed throughout the empire. And I think at its peak, around 1913, there were 75 to 100 of these, usually in large cities, and each one of them was headed by a senior gendarme officer. And these were the guys who went out and basically recruited agents, infiltrated people into opposition groups, and then compiled reports that were all sent back to the Department of Police in St. Petersburg. And the Okhrana also operated, though, a foreign agency, which was headquartered in Paris. And the reason for that was that because of political opponent, if you were an opponent of the Tsarist regime, you usually got caught and kicked out of the country. That's what would happen to you. I mean, there's like this revolt, this is what would generally happen. Somebody, almost always, of course, from the upper classes. So most revolutionaries, you'll always find, tend not to come from the poorest of the poor. No, poor people are always worried about keeping themselves fed. Okay, they can't worry about politics. They have to stay alive. But then you get people who generally tend to come from fairly affluent, educated backgrounds.
Like Napoleon, he was a prince, right?
Prince, right.
Yeah.
I mean, you tend to find the upper ranks of Russia. Lenin is a hereditary nobleman. His father, as a bureaucratic employee of essentially as a public school official. One of the ways you could attain upward mobility in Tsarist Russia is everything was governed by a thing called the table of ranks. And there were civil ranks and military ranks. And in theory, you could start at the bottom rank. And if you worked your way up high enough, you would attain first personal nobility. And then eventually you could attain hereditary nobility. I think roughly if there were 14 ranks, if you reached the 8th rank, then you and all of your progeny became hereditary nobles. And that's what Lenin's father had done. So Lenin was a hereditary nobleman. Trotsky came from a family, Trotsky's family was Jewish. They weren't hereditary noblemen, but they were all very successful with business. He had these millionaire uncles.
Right.
Not just one of them, but like 4 of them. And he came from a very, his father was also a businessman, a farmer. He ran a brick factory.
Right.
So they grew up pretty well. The only one,
bourgeoisie. They're basically part of the bourgeoisie itself.
Yeah. Okay. The haute bourgeoisie, the higher element of that. People with money and influence.
Right.
Stalin is one that you can pick that really seems to have come from fairly humble backgrounds, although even in his family, even in his Georgian family, there were people who were members of the Georgian nobility. You see, it's just at a certain point that nobility doesn't earn you any money.
Right.
So, you can find people who have, they don't have the proverbial pot to pee in, but nevertheless, they've, somewhere in the past, somebody got ennobled. And so I'm a noble. I have no, and that's the one thing that you have. Usually
theme of the impoverished samurai. In the Bakufu period, right? You had these noble titles, but you didn't really have. There are merchants who are much wealthier, right?
Yeah, you don't have land, you have nothing. Okay, noble's land was always based upon military service, some sort of service to the monarch, and usually land. But all of that really begins to change. I mean, initially, if you were to look at the Japanese or European or most other feudal elites were all based essentially, they were a warrior elite. So nobles in most cases were people who did the fighting.
Right.
they're killers, essentially. That's what their job is. They know the use of weapons. They can go out around other peasants to fight for you, and they're generally really good at killing people. And in return for that, they get certain powers. They don't have to pay taxes. There's something else. So, but that began to change when kings started ennobling pickle merchants. When it began, when someone who could buy a patent of nobility. Because the thing about monarchs is they're greedy and they always want more money. So what I can do now, see, I can create more nobles. So now I've got some rich banker who will pay me a lot of money to make him the Duke of Cheddar or something.
Right.
So I'll do that. And see, then it just continues until you get rock stars, becoming knights and
Sir Elton John.
Sir Elton John. So, and of course, there are two ways you can look at that. You can look at that as the democratization of nobility, which is kind of weird. Or you can look at it as just the commercialization of it, or if you prefer, the degeneration of the whole system. But you had the situation in Russia where people could work their way into the nobility, but revolutionary elites tend to come from, for the most part, affluent backgrounds, and that's even more the case if you look at the people who become the leaders of them. You still find these kind of class distinctions among them. And so what the Okhrana was dealing with was that generally what would happen is that someone would go to a university. So in Tsarist Russia, universities were the kindergartens of revolution. That's where you went. That's where people became, they would encounter radical ideas. They would join some sort of Marxist or anarchist study group. And the Okhrana would have someone infiltrated into that. Everybody would get busted. And then you'd either be sentenced to internal exile or you'd be exiled from the country. And if you got exiled from Russia, where would you go? Well, the place that people wanted to go generally was Paris. I mean, maybe Brussels, maybe Berlin, maybe London, but out of that choice, wouldn't you rather go to Paris?
I think so. Yeah.
So, you've got by the 1890s, there were 30,000 Russian emigres who were living around Paris. So this is why the Okhrana then set up the Foreign Agentura in Paris. And its whole job was to keep track of all of these radicalized emigres that were living abroad. And then from Paris, you have branches in London and Berlin and in Zurich and even in New York. Okay, I once came across a report from an Okhrana agent in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
That's random.
Because they were apparently keeping track of some emigre who had gone to Tulsa. But that shows you how pervasive this could be. San Francisco also would have people who would come and go, because in any place that Russians were coming in and out of, the Okhrana would have a presence. So the way that the Okhrana would recruit, what they became very, very good at was infiltration and provocation. So how do you recruit people in a revolutionary group? Well, pretty much the same way the FBI or anybody else does. You raid some radical student group, right? You haul them all in for questioning. And then you bring one of them aside and you go, look, you're going to work for us. You're going to give us reports about what all your comrades are doing. Well, your first response might be, no, I won't. And they go, well, we arrested you and all of your buddies, right? And let's say that we hold on to your buddies, maybe even kind of rough them up a little bit. And we just let you go right now. We'll just open the door and you can walk out. And if you don't agree to work for us, we'll then put the war down in the street that you are working for us. And when your buddies notice the fact that you're out and they're in here getting beat up, and they hear from the other people we already have in your organization that you're working for us, well, you know what's going to happen to you, right? So you see, you're going to work for us.
It's an offer you can't refuse.
It's an offer that you that you can't refuse. Now they could do it that way, or they could also do something else. And really, more often, they just figure out from people they already had in, where are the personal tensions? Who doesn't like each other? So you might find that within this organization, there's a person sitting at the top, the head of the central committee, and two other people are rivals. Okay, they're personal antagonisms. Somebody hates this person's guts. Then you can go, look, you know, you don't like this person. You work for us and help us get rid of the present head, and we'll put you in charge of things. And then you can kind of run it that way. The other thing they found that worked wonders was sexual jealousy. All right.
Honey trap?
Well, you know, let's say somebody had stolen somebody's girlfriend. All right. Yeah. So, I mean, that's one of the things you tended to find. There were a lot of intermixture, more than usual, intermixture between men and women in revolutionary groups.
Then you know, now too. I guess
yeah, and you know what happens as soon as you mix them together, right? So, all right, hanky panky will emerge.
Human
Sexual
nature.
politics will come out of this, and wherever you have that, you will then have jealousy. So, in fact, without giving too much, I once, one of the more interesting people I met, this is America in the 1970s. But there was a fellow I encountered through other people, and that had been his job. His job was infiltrating radical student groups. And his way of doing that was to essentially find out what the sexual landscape was within these groups. And he was in one group where he found out that not too strangely, he noticed that you would find in these groups that there'd be this kind of alpha pair at the top. Okay, this male and female alpha, the alpha group. Right. And what had happened was that the current male alpha had dumped one woman for another. And the dumpy, as usually, didn't take it that well.
Right.
And then he exploited that by essentially romancing her and then preying upon her feelings of rejection against the current alpha couple to get her to become an informant. So fiendishly clever. He said that the first clue he got to what, keep in mind, this was this kind of radical shake and bake Marxist group, where they were supposed to be, but he found one of the things he did was to search this girl's room and to get access to it, but then go through, and he goes, you have to look through things, you have to go through drawers, because people will occult things, they will hide things. And amongst various sort of feminist literature that he found in great abundance, what did he find tucked away somewhere in her room? A Modern Bride magazine. Not just one of them. One of these things that harbored the most sacred of bourgeois sexual imagery, but that was his insight into her. And this is one of the things you find, that it's like the old key that if you find someone who is a fanatic, this comes out of John Le Carre, if you find someone who is a fanatic, you now know something else. Every fanatic conceals doubt. That's why they're a fanatic. And therefore, the more vociferous and more fanatical their loyalty to something is that they have occulted a doubt. And that's what you can begin to work on. So having found what he thought was her Achilles heel, and then knowing that there was this whole atmosphere of jealousy, he managed to recruit her as an informant, and eventually brought the whole group down because she told him things that, you know, that led to the breakup of it. But then eventually it had to come to the point where he had to tell her what the real story was, because that also entailed him convincing her that he was in love with her and that they were somehow all going to go off and live happily ever after somewhere. And no, it actually came down to the point that you're going to have to go in and give testimony against all of your friends. And if you do it right, and with my help, you won't go to prison.
Ouch.
So the whole
Difficult job.
really wasn't there, and that's not what's going on. And so the only thing you have to do now is stay out of jail.
Right.
And to do that, you have to help me put your other friends into jail. And I remember him saying something, and it is kind of diabolical, and it was kind of a scary person, because I might argue that among this, he did argue that there was one point that he felt bad about it.
Mhm.
And the point that he felt bad about it was when he was telling her what the situation really was. And he goes, and you know, and in watching her face, I could tell you the precise instant that she crumbled. That when all of this sort of came in, and she psychologically just sort of collapsed. But that's also this point of vulnerability. That's when you know you can basically get them to sign anything and do the rest of it. And he goes, that was the one real moment that comes up to that I felt real pity for her. But then you have to go on and do it otherwise. But that's what, I mean, this, again, there's nothing particularly unique about what the Okhrana did. This is what you do.
Right.
And that's what's necessary, I suppose.
I've heard similar things in like even to this day in activist circles. You know, people I know, friends in passing, people I know who have participated in like kind of radical far left activism, and one gets the impression that those things still occur. I've also heard a couple of stories about like in the wake of 9/11, in various Muslim communities, like a similar type of things in which, in fact, I think one informant slash infiltrator actually went to the Washington Post, if I remember correctly. I would have to dig it out my notes, but he actually sort of just like confessed all. It's like, oh, I used to do this. I would seduce these women and this, and it made me feel really guilty. I just felt bad. Yeah, it's a dirty job.
Well, if it's something where if you have a lot of conscience, it's not a job you're going to do well, you're going to do it long. But the thing to keep in mind is that there are people who don't.
Right.
So it's another one of those things. It's another part of the occult world you don't often see, because generally you only see the surfaces of people.
Right.
And it takes in the case of the guy I was talking about, I don't think there are a lot of people like that, but he was very, very good at what he did. And it was, even in time, it was very pleasant, interesting. It's the charming psychopath. That's the whole point here. Yeah. You got those, and it's well, I mean, here's another sort of mega historical idea, is that if you also tend to look at the general history of humanity, it's basically the common herd being led by psychopaths.
That's definitely one way that you could sum it up.
It takes that to it. I mean, if you look at people, look at Alexander the Great. Okay, there's a megalomaniac for you. I mean, what king, successful conqueror anywhere at any time doesn't essentially have to be a psychopath to do what they need to do?
Right.
And on the other hand, the rest of us all tend to worship these people.
Disturbingly. we call, for example, Alexander the Great. Why is he the Great? He killed a lot of people. He conquered a lot of things, so he's great.
He was off on some sort of, long-term personal crusade to prove himself more important than his dad. Okay, I mean, you can go back. He had like weird relationship with his parents. Okay, he had to do more than dad did, and his army was loyal to him. Napoleon is another example of it.
Right.
I mean, this intense. And that's one of the things you would notice if you look at that, is that the loyalty of people isn't really to France or to the state or whatever it may be. The loyalty is to these individuals.
Hmm.
It's this kind of bond between the person in which somehow the leader becomes an extension of themselves. And yet, if you look at it from the outside, the only thing that leaders are ever doing is simply aggrandizing themselves and using the rest of us as cannon fodder. And we
they're
just
very good.
And we just line up like, and just follow them. Okay. Or the other thing is that human history are sheep being led by Judas goats to the slaughter. So that's not a pleasant way of thinking about it.
I think it's a fair summation, actually.
But if you tend to look at it, that's pretty much what's going on.
Hmm.
And it's
Yeah. It's
so
the
that,
occult side of the human character. It's the hidden side, in a sense. Would you say?
I think I don't think human beings know themselves very well. Okay. I don't think we've ever quite figured out what we were or what we are. I mean, on one hand, you can put it, it was a professor of mine who once someone was talking about sort of grants for things, the grant, they asked to sort of envision, some kind of utopian society. But he goes, and they're asked what they thought of it. He goes, I think that's very high aspirations for a talking ape. So
aim high, though.
yeah,
Shoot for the stars to hit the moon.
Right. So I've occasionally, when I was teaching, I would use that with students every now and then, humorously. So how are all of my talking apes today? So here we are. We're all going to do this. So that's one thing we're pretty sure of.
Right.
And because, we are apes, really, aren't we? So
we're simians.
Yeah,
special simians, I like to think. Very special simians, but we are.
We like to think we are, but why wouldn't we? I mean, I imagine that chimps tend to think that they're special.
Right.
It's a that sort of goes back to this whole thing. My main animal interaction is with dogs, and I can't really get into cats' heads. I don't know what's going on there. All right, they're mysterious.
Yes.
The dogs, you really know on a certain level, but then in other cases, you just have no idea what's going on there. And part of it is because they're living in a different world than we are.
Yeah.
And I think that's I'm sure there is mystified by our behavior as well. But those are all things. It's these basic. That's what something that an intelligence or security agency or the people in it really need to understand. It's like the fellow who was describing who went through the girl's room and he found the Modern Bride magazine. Right. What he was doing was he was finding her sort of the things that she had occulted in her life. And those to him provided points of vulnerability that he could exploit. Much of which she probably wouldn't even been aware of herself. But in the end, you could maybe even make an argument that he through just examining, through this kind of forensic investigation of her, through this penetration of her inner world, he had a better idea of who she was than she did, or a better idea as to at least how to manipulate those different portions of it.
Right.
And I guess to kind of, draw us back to where we were, that's what the Okhrana became excellent at doing. to the point that arguably, which means, it's debatable. I don't think it's too debatable. By the time you get up to 1913, but by the time you get up to the decade preceding the Russian Revolution,
Right.
the Okhrana has thoroughly penetrated every revolutionary group, all of them. They have their agents highly placed within these organizations. Every central committee or central governor of every revolutionary party was infested with Okhrana informers. To the extent that you could argue that the Okhrana effectively controlled those organizations. They were able to manipulate them. So the question then becomes, well, if your job, if the job of, if your job is to guarantee the security of the state, then why don't you destroy them? I mean, you know who the leaders are, you know where they meet, you know what's going on. They're not doing anything that you're not aware of.
Right.
I mean, they can't even effectively go out and plot any kind of revolution because you know what they're doing every step of the way.
Right.
So why don't you just round them all up and shoot them? Well, the answer to that is if you did, then other revolutionary groups would arise and you just have to start all over again. So it's better just to maintain and manipulate the groups that we have. But there's also an even more, let's say, occult reason why a security agency would not destroy the groups that it is ostensibly created to destroy.
Right.
Because to destroy them would be to destroy the whole purpose for your existence. If you exist to combat subversion, there must be subversion.
Yes. No subversion, no reason to exist.
No reason to exist.
Right.
Thank you, Okhrana, for doing all this wonderful work. We're all safe now. You're all fired.
Right.
So no, they never do that.
It's not job security.
Because, see, bureaucracies become these kind of living things. They become these organisms.
Right.
They absorb resources and they perform functions, and every organism's chief, it's the main directive is to survive and to grow.
Yeah.
So
grow and then maybe reproduce.
And
replicate.
Expand your influence, gain more and more territory. But you almost never hear that, nah, we don't need as much money. Okay. You only have to give us half as money because we only have half as much work to do. And we've actually been pretty successful. We've done everything we're going to do. I guess you don't need us anymore. I've never heard any bureaucrat say that.
That would definitely go against the prime imperative: survive at all costs.
So the Okhrana effectively control these groups and kept them. So then you begin to enter the realm, and here it's questions. I couldn't give you answers to this, but you've got the situation that the control or thorough manipulation of these subversive groups was there, but you're now managing them. You're not destroying them. You're sort of operating them.
Right.
Because their existence is tied to your existence. But then after a while, it inevitably begins to create this kind of weird zone in which you become the same thing.
Right.
At what point does an infiltrated, manipulative, or manipulated revolutionary group simply become another arm of the security service?
Right. It's fuzzy, but I could see where that overlap would begin to occur. Maybe.
Who are you actually working for?
Right.
Yeah.
Who are you working for?
And
right.
I think that's part of the situation that you encountered by the time you got to 1917, which was the Okhrana was playing a very complicated game it also never seemed in particularly to bestir itself with any interest in preserving the monarchy.
The state, not necessarily the monarchy. They protected the state.
It's,
Not necessarily.
well, so Nicholas is forced to abdicate. He never actually does so willingly. He's basically kidnapped,
Mhm.
which is what happens. Okay, there is, by the way, a conspiracy among not revolutionaries, but among essentially what we would call the Russian liberals. Okay,
Right.
the democratic reform. Essentially, the whole overthrow of the czar was engineered by people in his own parliament. By
So those
by
the social democrats primarily are.
no, the people, the cadets and the
Ah.
Octobrists. Okay,
Oh yes.
these were
Yes. Yes.
the what were called the liberal parties. Okay,
Right.
they before, like 2 months before, they'd all styled themselves constitutional monarchists.
Mhm.
Yes, we love the monarch. Nicholas may be a lousy czar, but we're all devoted to the monarchy. Well, they weren't. They were just devoted to their own ambition. So Nicholas was basically kidnapped, largely told that you'll never see your son or family again. We'll never allow you to reunite with them unless you abdicate for yourself and him. And he does. And then you create this thing called the provisional government.
Mhm.
And the provisional government eventually gets this kind of quasi-socialist Alexander Kerensky at the top, but
Mhm.
mostly you would find that the key figures in it initially were people from the Constitutional Democrat Party,
Okay.
the Cadet Party it was called,
Right.
or a thing called the Octobrist Party that were just slightly right-wing liberals.
Right.
They were split into different, mostly personal factions. One of the more interesting things that the provisional government, which on the whole was pretty thoroughly inept, did was that they started this whole investigation of the Okhrana. First of all, they abolished it because they saw it as, so they were going to abolish the secret police. We're going to take its records. And they actually began this thing that sounds a lot like now what would be called a kind of reconciliation commission.
Mhm.
Okay, we're going to draw in all of these police figures, all of these reformers, and we're going to get them all to come in and give public testimony about how this organization operated.
Right.
Because I think there were people within the provisional government, and Kerensky was one of them, that knew how pervasive this organization was. And they were afraid of it. And one of the ways in some ways to dispel that was to publicly reveal it.
Right.
So we're going to bring in the senior Okhrana and Department of Police, the gendarmes, and we're all going to put them, and they're all going to give testimony as to how this operated.
Right.
And what they thought they were doing is that they were putting the czarist regime on trial.
Mhm.
But what they're really doing is that they were trying to expose this security agency.
Right.
But then they only get so far. The provisional government only lasted about 8 months.
Mhm.
And the hearings that they held do reveal a lot of interesting things, like how everybody was essentially, how the secret police were everywhere.
Right.
And all kinds of people were working. But that's what it began to expose. It began to expose the fact that, well, the secret police just didn't have informers in the revolutionary parties. They had people in the liberal parties. They had people everywhere. So you
Right.
see, do you really want all of these secrets exposed? Do you really want to know how pervasive our influence was? Do you really want to know how many people sitting in the Duma informed to us?
In the provisional government.
And so notice that when the Bolsheviks come along, one of the things that Lenin does not do is to continue this whole process. Okay, he basically argues that it's pointless. The other thing that he immediately does is to reinstall a security service.
Right.
And I mean, the provisional government tried that. There actually was, they did try to recreate some kind of security service, but the problem was is that the only way to do that is that, well, think of it this way. Where are we going to get experienced people? Okay, we want to set up a service. So where are we going to come from? The Okhrana.
Right.
We're just going to have to turn around and rehire some of these guys. And we'll ask them, oh, you're going to be loyal to us now, right? Sure. You pay me. I'm a professional, right? So I do the work for whoever it is that pays me.
Right.
Maybe that's what I'll tell you. So they tried to set up this service that would, inevitably had to bring it, but Lenin didn't really worry about that. He put Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was considered to be a loyal Bolshevik, at the head of the whole thing, the Cheka. And then what Dzerzhinsky did was to go out and hire every sort of Okhrana he could find to work for him, because he needed professionals.
Something similar happened in Iran after the Khomeini's revolution. If I remember correctly, a lot of the Savak personnel just mysteriously started working for the Islamic Republic.
Yeah. Because that's where the paycheck comes from.
And you need people with that sort of expertise.
You need, again, it's like the guy I described in the Bride magazine. I mean, you where else are you going to get those people? If you need them, you're going to have to hire the same one.
But
so,
no, go ahead. Sorry.
No, the idea, of course, is that what you're dealing is what you'll get from them is that, okay, look, I'm a professional. I'm a professional intelligence officer. I'm a professional security expert. I have skills and knowledge. And I'll simply put those skills and knowledge to work for whoever will pay me. And a kind of post-revolutionary situation where otherwise, again, having served the old regime, you might get shot. Well, the way you can avoid that is by making yourself useful to the new masters.
Very reasonable.
Saying, I have skills and knowledge and I can put them at your disposal. You have enemies. I know how to find your enemies. See, I found you, right? You remember what we did. And therefore, I can do the same kind of work for you. And they did. Quite effectively.
Right. I read that both the after the Cheka, the NKVD, the KGB, but also the Mossad in Israel, both operated largely based on Okhrana kind of doctrine and methodology. Mainly, I think, due to the influence of certain Russian immigrants who immigrate to Israel and help the fledgling state set up their services. But I mean, if you're a professional and you have these skills, then of course you're going to want to be hired and useful to whoever's in power. But I would imagine that would beg a question: who's actually really in control?
Yes, who's in charge?
Right.
Is it just a lot of desperate people who want to stay alive and keep eating, who are willing to work for whoever will pay them? Or is there some sort of occult agenda which they have that is the goal to preserve? Remember, we talked about the agency as being like a living thing, and living things survive by adaptation. You don't adapt, you become extinct. On the other hand, if you simply adapt to the new situation, if you begin to find the way to appease and apparently serve your new masters, in time, you can become the masters.
This is
it's one of those things that you find. You can find this a lot if you look through different areas of history where military mercenaries who are hired to serve a particular monarchy or a regime eventually end up in control.
That happened quite a bit in the history of the Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Towards the end, if I recall.
Another place you can find it is in the the history of the Islamic Caliphate. particularly under the Abbasids. You'll have these, these armies that are essentially slave armies.
Turkic mercenaries.
The Turkish, they would eventually, the Abbasid caliphs just, decided they would just buy a lot of, Turkish boys. All right. And these would be the Mamluks. Okay.
Right.
All of the Mamluk dynasties are descended from these Turkish slaves who were purchased.
Right.
But in each of these cases, they eventually become the ruling group because the state becomes completely dependent upon them to protect them.
Fairly quickly.
Fairly quick. And then you just become, there's one period, I don't know, in the 12th century in which, the Mamluks in Baghdad are just murdering one caliph after another and basically doing the old Praetorian Guard thing of auctioning off the crown to the highest bidder. And you then end up with these Mamluk generals who, they're in control. The Caliph now just becomes a figurehead, which we can dispose of and replace with whichever ones that we want.
Essentially a kept figurehead, almost a hostage in a sense.
Yeah. Well, really, in many cases, literally a prisoner.
Right.
Someone that you would just, because this is your, this is the fig leaf of legitimacy you have.
Mm-hmm.
See, this person has the right ties, and we can say that gives us legitimacy, but they're just our prisoner.
Mm-hmm.
So it's you can make this kind of interesting argument. And again, it's just a theory. It's just an argument that what you have here is that this segue between the Okhrana as this kind of gray eminence in the Tsarist regime, this group which is ostensibly protecting the regime, but then notice at the critical point doesn't.
At the exact critical juncture that one would expect them to protect the regime.
Right. Why couldn't they have informed? They must have known about these plots going on. So how was it that the Okhrana who could figure out all of these other things couldn't save Nicholas's throne? And to me, the only answer to that is that they didn't want to. That had now, in other words, the monarchy had kind of served its usefulness so far as they were concerned. And so now we'll simply attach our, because every regime that comes along will need us.
Right.
And then we will serve them. But in the process, we will also continue to grow and advance.
Which makes one wonder who is serving whom in that particular case.
Yeah, notice that under the Soviet regime, the counter-revolutionary conspiracies just never end, do they?
Constantly.
Never end. It's the White Guards or it's the bourgeois wreckers, and then eventually it's the Trotskyites. There you go. It's the Trotskyites. And we're always there to protect you, to protect everybody from those. So, and then you get when the Soviet Union collapses, on the other hand, the KGB ostensibly disappears, but now it just becomes the SVR and the FSB. And is it too surprising that the person who eventually emerges the primary leader is, guess what? Guess what? What's his whole background? Putin, the KGB agent.
It's almost as if the Okhrana, for the sake of argument, and metaphorically speaking, one could say that the Okhrana spent about 100 years just to get one of their own.
One of their own.
The crown.
Right.
Openly.
It was it's, they were enemies of one of the people the Soviet enemies of Stalin. Let's say, those Trotskyites we were talking about. They would always, one of the terms they would use for Stalin was the provocateur enthroned.
Yes.
Yeah. And this was the whole idea that Stalin had been an Okhrana informer,
right?
Which he probably was, but then who wasn't? That's the question. Who wasn't to one degree or another? And that he was a provocateur, and that he was now this prior informer who had now become the head of the party and the the leader of
Right.
progressive mankind, all started out as a police snitch.
Right.
Well, why not? You got to start somewhere.
Huh? Yeah. A man's got to start somewhere, somehow. It's a long way to the top.
You got to do what you got to do.
Right. It makes, there's always the danger of conflation and confabulation and seeing patterns within random data. But I mean, I personally wondered, like I had read a long time ago that there were some suspicions that Trotsky has implied that Stalin was an Okhrana agent or informer or something like that. And I couldn't find any solid documentation of that, although I found it seemed like conspiratorial, conspiracy theory fare. But it made sense. That man was very comfortable using and manipulating secret services in a degree that his predecessors did not seem to be, if that makes sense. He seemed to understand how to do this a little too well, in a sense.
Well, the one thing you can say for Stalin is that he didn't place too much trust in his security services. Notice he keeps changing the heads of them. Okay, during the 30s, you go from Yagoda, who's a piece of work, and then he's replaced with Yezhov, and then Yezhov is eventually replaced with Beria. Eventually get it down to a fellow Georgian that you can trust. Okay, Stalin tends to bring that closer to him, but yeah, I don't think Stalin ever had the illusion. Yeah, see, this is going to bring one of the things I've been accused of it being is a Stalinist apologist. Okay, so I want to point out here that I have no particular love for Joseph Stalin, and that he probably is one of the 20th century's great butchers, but he's not stupid. Right. That's one of the things, and there's a, you got to admire his work to a certain extent. He certainly succeeded where others did not, but I think perhaps one reason for that is that he was always at some point aware that his Chekists could turn on him, that this was not something that you gave free rein to, and that every now and then it was a good idea to shake things up. Because one of the things you find in the 30s is that there is almost a complete house clearing of the old Chekists.
Right. Yeah. Just total purge.
Yeah. Eliminated almost completely. I mean, they're essentially wiped out and replaced with new people. And these were people who had done, all of the kind of real surface in keeping the regime alive in many ways, going back to 1918. And yet when you look at some of those people, it is possible to kind of sort of question what their motives were. And it comes into this, it comes into questions that what was there such a thing as a Trotskyist conspiracy against Stalin? Okay, what was there a real Trotskyist plot, and a plot within the USSR against Stalin? Was there a real menace, or was this menace completely fabricated? Well, I mean, there was Trotsky. There were Trotskyists, or the other term, Trotskyites. They really hate that term, which I'll continue to use it anyway. The Trotskyites. There was an opposition. There's no. I mean, why wouldn't there have been an opposition?
Right.
Because there was a real opposition within the party. I don't think the opposition was unified in any particular way. But there was a real opposition that wanted to get rid of Stalin.
Right.
they couldn't really agree upon doing that, and it wasn't just the Trotskyists who were a part of this. So to try to pretend that there's no sort of that there were anti-Stalin movements and conspiracies, how big they were, to what what part of them is real, and then what part of them is imaginary, is again all part of what it is that the NKVD, or let's simply call it what the Chekhists are creating. But they're doing exactly the same thing that they did back before 1917 with the revolutionary groups.
Right.
They're sort of managing this threat as opposed to actually destroying it, which I think is something that Stalin, towards the end of the 30s, caught on to. And I think that's why he got rid of so many of these people, that it was, it's one of the questions he eventually had for Henryk Yagoda, who was the fellow who ran things up to about 36, and who first, when the purges first began, Yagoda was there. And Stalin's condemnation of him was that, look, you knew what all of these people were doing before, so why aren't you moving faster against these groups? Why aren't you arresting? You know all of this, so why in a sense did things ever get as far as they did if you were doing the job you told me that you were doing?
Right. It's a fair question.
Were you just letting them? Were you allowing them to exist, in part because this gave you a reason to act against them, but again, you have no real incentive to destroy them?
Right.
So there are a lot of questions in, well, there's just, that's what history's full of. It's the questions.
The questions are what makes it worthwhile. It's what makes it interesting and fascinating, I think.
I used to like to tell students is that the whole thing that in history is not knowing what the answers are, because those are actually pretty few and far between, but it's understanding the questions.
Right.
Once you know what the questions are, then you can investigate them and try to find your own answers.
Right.
But when people come to you, they go, well, history's just, it's this, and this, and this, and this, it's all sort of written down, and there's a whole sort of, there's a plot, there's a narrative,
right,
i.e. a story. Okay, there's a narrative,
story,
and this explains everything, which it really doesn't.
It's a narrative, though. It provides a sort of linear explanation, but it's not the explanation.
Well, you can come up, you can replace one narrative with another narrative.
Right.
So you don't like this story? Well, I'll give you another story. It's a screenplay. That's what most history is. It's a screenplay that's been written to explain this whole movie that we think that we're living in. And it can be rewritten, and you can come up with a different version. And those versions, that's one of the things you can try. How many different sort of plausible narratives can you come up to explain something?
I think that's a really useful exercise to do. You take an event or something, and you just, it would seem to me that would be a really fascinating mental exercise to try. How many narratives can I come up with for this situation?
Well, here's a tiny example. Think of the JFK assassination, and then think of how many conspiracy theories there are.
Right.
Most of which, some are more believable than others, but the thing is that all of them sort of, they create this different narrative. Jack Kennedy gets his head blown off in Dallas. Okay, that much we know. All right.
Fact one.
I guess we know that, unless you want to buy into the idea that he's all living on an island somewhere.
Right.
But then it just enters this zone where you can just create, you can create a scenario where Oswald did it, where Oswald is the patsy, where Oswald's a good guy, he's the villain, he's this, he's immaterial, it's not Oswald at all, you're looking in the wrong direction. No, it's this person, it's that person, it's J. Edgar Hoover, no, it's the Cubans.
Right.
And you can create a narrative, you could write a story that would make those pieces fit any way you wanted them to fit. But only one of them can be true.
Yes. But any one of them can be put down on ink and paper and put out as a story.
Yeah.
One of which would be true, but we have no direct, like you're saying that the island idea. There's a fellow whose website I stumbled across on the internet. Um, I think if a lot of people looked at it, they would think the man was insane. I mean, completely just crazy nutter.
Yeah.
But his theory is that a lot of assassinations in history, it's really a matter of intelligence agencies moving their own operatives around who are playing roles, and then they retire them, and you get a nice, you get to sit on the beach and sip margaritas. And the thing is, when someone could say, "Oh, that's misinformation. You're a paranoid conspiracy theorist. You're a nutter," but we can't really prove that didn't happen. Like, we can't really definitively, beyond a shadow of a doubt, you can always find something. It's like, okay, well, the people who witnessed this, okay, maybe there's a Bruder film. It wasn't actually filmed at the time. That was actually filmed some other time. You could say that it was a simulation of the event and something else happened. I mean, someone could problematize anything, and at the end of the day, how would you really ruthlessly, definitively prove, unless you knew a witness or you were a witness yourself? And then you can fall down this epistemological rabbit hole of, how do we really know anything?
Well, you got people who believe that you could fake a moon landing. So if you could fake a moon landing, you could fake an assassination.
Yeah, that's.
No, I don't want to. I have one point here. I'm not.
This is.
I don't think the moon
are,
landing was.
It's not even a
faked.
hypothesis. It's like someone claims this, though. It's a narrative. So people have claimed that. I don't have to believe it, but you can make an interesting movie out of it.
Could it be done? Yeah, if you put your mind to it. I mean, the JFK thing has always struck me is that the way that you hide, the idea is that, well, there can't be a conspiracy because, then people would find it, you couldn't keep it secret. Well, obviously you didn't keep it secret. Okay.
This is the whole point, yes.
But you realize that, if you think about it, we're never going to be able to keep this secret. So how do you hide a conspiracy? You hide it among a bunch of other conspiracies.
Right.
So what you begin to do is you would start putting out all these alternative narratives.
Mm-hmm.
The original conspirators partly invent other conspiracies. In fact, they feed the idea that there's a conspiracy, right, and then begin to lead. There's another one of these in intelligence terms, is that the point of disinformation.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one of the terms that come up. There's misinformation. Misinformation is just stuff that's wrong. Okay, it's a mistake. It's misinformation.
Right.
Disinformation, however, in many cases is mostly true, but it contains a kind of poison pill.
Right.
And the goal of all disinformation is to lead the hounds away from the fox, to eventually divert attention off into a kind of harmless direction. Send people, chasing after the Cubans, or chasing after the mafia, or chasing after the, whatever it is, but never in the direction you're supposed to be looking. And disinformation as an art, as something that people deliberately do, is very, very real. I mean, we deal with it all the time in advertising, Advertising is just a carefully constructed lie to one degree or another, because they're never really telling you the whole truth, are they?
How could they?
No.
Our deodorant lasts 24 hours, but it also gives you a rash. We're not going to.
Yeah.
A rash.
Could cause armpit cancer, but we're not going to tell you that, because studies are unclear on that particular point.
It's in the small print.
Yeah. So it's one of those things that you can confront to a certain degree, is that there are so many false narratives. There are so many different conflicting views of things that cannot really be reconciled with each other. And again, only one of them can really be true. So how do you know what's real? Who do you believe?
The Mitrokhin archive, when the Berlin Wall fell, and then Gorbachev essentially would abdicate that would not be the right term. Gorbachev retired in a sense, I guess you could say.
In a different time and place, you could call it an abdication.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I found interesting was when these KGB archives were opened up and some of the things were published. Speaking of conspiracies and conspiracists, it appeared that the KGB were conspiracists in propagating conspiracy theories, for example, about the JFK assassination or about multiple different things, which is interesting. They put that disinformation out, but is it necessarily disinformation at that? Or could one, there's so many, you take this thread and you throw it in a large ball of yarn and you can just pull it out in different ways. And it becomes fascinating as an intellectual exercise, but at the end of the day, I don't know, how do we actually know that that really was a KGB operation? Or if it was a KGB operation, does it necessarily have to have been false? Maybe the KGB just wanted to put out a particular narrative for its own purposes. Could have been true, could have been false.
Well, they're going to do what they're going to do, which is they're going, if there's uncertainty and consternation in American circles about what actually happened to JFK, then they're going to play on that.
Right.
So they will spin other narratives of their own. Of course, you could also get somebody, you could get a KGB agent who could argue that, look, who has a greater incentive to lie to you about the assassination, us or your own agencies? Who are most likely to have been involved in it? So you see, we're more likely to be honest with you because we're outsiders in this regard. I mean, could you ever trust the CIA or the FBI to be honest? Because let's face it, their fingerprints are kind of all over a lot of things, and they're much. Yes, and if there is, and if an assassination occurs, it's more likely to occur closer to the throne than further away. I think that was a rule once. If you want to look for the assassin, never look far from the throne.
That's probably a good rule of thumb in history.
Look at the person standing behind the throne.
Right.
So,
in some cases, quite literally, there's the Ulugh Beg, the famous astronomer and scientist of Samarkand. He was also a Timurid ruler. He built the great observatory in Samarkand, was in now modern Uzbekistan, and his rule was mainly spent patronizing mathematicians and scientists. And someone didn't like that, and it turned out it was his son, and probably other people, and behind the throne. So he was assassinated, and history bears there was actually quite literally the person sitting next to him on the throne, his son, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's the old rule of who benefits. Right. Something happens. If this person is assassinated, who benefited from that? So that's why there are those who argue, if you look at the JFK assassination, you really have to look no further than his previous rival, the man that he had essentially, as it seemed, had stolen the Democratic nomination from in 1960, who? Lyndon Baines Johnson. They were not friends.
No.
But the thing about Jack Kennedy is that what he managed to do in a fairly short lifespan was to piss off a lot of people.
Never good for your long-term living prospects.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, when J. Edgar Hoover and Allen Dulles and Lyndon Baines Johnson all hate your guts, right, it could be perilous. But that may be entirely immaterial to the whole thing, but you could never be entirely sure.
we can never have complete closure and complete certitude.
Well, you have to look at it. I guess in some ways you have to think like a cop or a detective.
Right.
Okay, so you look at it, who has proxy, who has motive and opportunity?
Right.
Is there some sort of past grudge between these people?
Mm-hmm.
And who would be a reasonable suspect?
Right.
Okay. So if you're looking at any kind of homicide, the first thing you look at, you don't look at total strangers, you look at the people that they know, family and friends. And most of the time, 99% of the time, that's where they'll be. People who are close to the victim.
Right. Motive, opportunity, most likely some axe to grind. Yeah, very close at hand. It's I suspect, I would imagine that part of being a good historian is actually being a detective in a sense. You would have to be able to follow clues, not just deduce, but there's deduction, there's induction. You're sort of doing a bit of detective work.
It is. I mean, in a lot of the stuff, I think all of the historical characters that I've looked at have to one degree or another, and this is my fault for going into it, but they're all liars. Okay, they're all lying about things. I'd actually say that of the historical figures that I've dug into, the person who's probably more truthful than the others is Aleister Crowley. I mean, Crowley's very self-interested, and he's always, everybody's skewing things to their own advantage. Everybody's trying to make themselves look good. But generally, I would trust that if he says something, there's at least some element of truth in it. So for instance, when Crowley would make these vague statements on and off that he had worked for, His Majesty's government, or he had worked for British intelligence. I mean, he never actually comes out and say, he never at any point says, I worked for British intelligence, but he says, what I was doing in America during the war, people in the Admiralty knew about, which was as close as he could get to that.
Right.
And that was true. He wasn't making that up.
Which is remarkable. People would think of Crowley as the great beast 666, this great devil, but so he must be an inveterate liar. But seems
I think he lied about all kinds of things, but he wasn't lying about that, and he wasn't lying about other aspects in it. On the other hand, if you contrast him with someone like the supposed ace of spies, Sidney Reilly lied about everything. I mean, nothing that man ever uttered. I mean, there may have been truth in it, but it was always inclined to deceive.
The model of James Bond, right?
Well, yeah, but see, that's that kind of. Well, the simple answer to that, no. It has nothing to do with it, one way or the other.
Is that one of these little canards that people throw out? That James Bond.
It's supposed to have been something. You get different versions that Ian Fleming supposedly said, and if you look at it, what Ian Fleming said is that, well, James Bond says something I made up. He's not Sidney Reilly, And what he meant by that, I've never actually been able to confirm that anyone ever heard him say it. But what he would have meant by it is that, well, Reilly was a real person, and this person is fictional.
Right.
It's not really saying that that I modeled him on there. At no point did that ever come up.
Right.
And Reilly was essentially, more than anything else, a kind of international con man. He was an international businessman who also, he was a broker in information.
Right.
But everything about him is false. I mean, he's not even Sidney Reilly. There is no Sidney Reilly.
Right.
Sidney George Reilly was the name on a British passport that he got in 1899 because he had to get out of town. And the head of Scotland Yard, a guy by the name of William Melville, who had employed him as an informant, gave him the passport. But what had happened is that Reilly had sort of been exposed in certain things, and he gets that passport and he goes off to China. and spends the next 3 years doing business in China. Because for reasons that aren't totally clear, there's nothing else,
Right.
his further presence in London had become very problematic for Melville. Now, the interesting thing is that when Melville then retires early from Scotland Yard in 1903, and he opens up his own private detective agency, which isn't exactly a private detective agency, Reilly returns from exile in the Far East.
Curious. It makes one wonder what he was doing in China beyond not being inconvenient to Melville.
He was in business. He was running a business called Grinberg and Reilly. And they set up a business in China, in Port Arthur, and were selling all kinds of things. They were, importing American timber, guns, whatever you wanted.
Right.
They were general merchants. So there was a real business.
Right.
In the same way that Reilly was a real chemist under his previous name of Sigmund Rosenblum, and who held multiple patents for chemical procedures.
Which is fascinating.
Which meant
he was
that
very young. He was very young at that time when he first arrived in London.
The first place he shows up, the first place that Sigmund Rosenblum shows up, Sigmund Solomon Rosenblum, is that he's in England in 1894, working as a junior chemist in Bristol for the Polysulfan Soap Company. And that's where the patents come up that have to do with the distillation of plant and animal fats for use as soap. I mean, it's just that sexy, all right? It's a soap factory.
Right.
Now, the interesting thing is that the Polysulfan Soap Factory is German owned. So it's operating in England, but its owner is a German.
Right.
And it's all managed from there. And that, I think, is what I still don't know. What you can't figure out is how Rosenblum came to Bristol to go to work for this German-owned company. And also where he got his chemical education.
Right.
Because I've searched through the records of every major European university that I can think that he might have attended, and there's no trace of a Sigmund Rosenblum in any of those places.
It's remarkable.
None. In fact, there are a couple of people who sort of fit the general profile. They're the right age,
right?
But there's a different name. But I don't know whether that's the real name. Sigmund Rosenblum is almost certainly a name he appropriated somewhere along the line. I mean, there was a real Sigmund Rosenblum. I can demonstrate that. I can tell you where he was born and who his parents and his grandparents were and where he went to school. But what I can't tell you is whether or not that Sigmund Rosenblum is the same Sigmund Rosenblum who's working for the Polysulfan Soap Company in 1894. And I don't think they are. I think somewhere they cross paths somewhere along the line. The real Sigmund Rosenblum probably was deceased and someone else appropriated his identity.
Would make sense. That would be a perfect, a spy needs a legend, like you mentioned before.
Yeah. But you would think you got this. I mean, the thing about Rosenblum, the guy who would become Reilly, is that he does know chemistry. I mean, you just didn't, he had the know-how to do these. So he had to have been trained somewhere. But there's no trace of that education so you think you would go back and you'd pretty easy to find that, the University of Heidelberg, the University of Leipzig, wherever it was, this is where Sigmund Rosenblum got his background in chemistry. But he's not there. There's no there when you go to look for it.
So he's a historical cipher in a way. It's like someone pops into history at a certain point and he has these skills, these talents, this academic and practical knowledge. But where he really came from is that's the ongoing. There are sort of two open holes. There are open doors. Let's put it this way: both ends of his life. So,
you never know quite where it was that he came from, what his original name was. And then you also have to figure, why would you go to all the trouble to hide that? Remember, this is the thing again, it comes back to the occult.
Mhm.
What has Reilly occulted? He has occulted who he really is.
Right.
His whole life is in some way the creation of this continuous legend under different names, all of which disguises who he really is.
Hmm.
Why? What would knowing that tell you?
Well, why he perhaps knowing that would give more insight into how he became what he became. How did he become this versatile spy informant? Why was he so useful to certain governments? You know, he's a man. He has certain skills and talents. Knowing who he is might tell you a little bit more about that. There's something in your book, Wall Street and the Russian Revolution,
Mm.
uh, that I found really interesting when I stumbled across it just reading through. Trotsky's wealthy Uncle Abram
Mhm.
and Sidney Reilly in New York, and Sidney Reilly working for his Uncle Abram.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting tangent. Well, not
Well,
tangent.
they're all kinds. So if you begin to piece little things together, okay, and this is where again you just have to look at little things that come up.
Mm-hmm.
So again, Trotsky's real name was Bronstein. Okay, comes from what's now Ukraine, from the area not far around Odessa.
Right.
And so if you tend to look through different references to Reilly's origins or things that come up, all the threads seem to lead back to Odessa.
Hmm.
And that he seems to have some connection to Odessa. Now, keep in mind, the Bronstein family, Trotsky's roots are also around Odessa.
Right.
Trotsky's mother came from the Zhivatovsky family. Zhivatovsky was a family largely of Jewish merchants, and she had four brothers, all of whom went on to become fairly successful businessmen, especially Uncle Abram.
Hmm.
And if you read Trotsky's autobiography, My Life, one of the things he mentions about his childhood is that he's particularly close to Uncle Abram.
Hmm.
Makes some comment, you know, he makes some comment that I was one of the few sort of nephews that Uncle Abram ever paid. I was the only one he ever took any interest in.
Hmm.
And he'll mention, by the way, he never mentions his last name. He never mentions the name Zhivatovsky because that's the way, but
Right.
Uncle Abram. And then also he'll mention I have another Uncle Brodsky who's a brewer in Kiev. Well, there was a large Brodsky brewing family in
Hmm.
Kiev, so he's quite well connected.
Right.
So Trotsky's relations are the most part in what could be called the kind of late Tsarist Jewish commercial elite of Russia.
Mm-hmm.
An interesting background for eventual Marxist revolutionary, but then
For sure.
so. But then who knows the dark sins of the bourgeoisie better than a son of the bourgeoisie?
This is true.
So
As they say.
um, you've then got this Zhivatovsky connection, and then Reilly, who before World War I is mostly doing business again in Russia as Reilly, becomes associated with Abram Zhivatovsky. So much so that when the First World War breaks out, Zhivatovsky hires Reilly to go off and do war purchasing in Japan and America.
Hmm.
So in New York in 1915, Reilly has an office in the Equitable Building
Mm-hmm.
at 120 Broadway, and that office is the headquarters of the Petrograd Trading Company. And the president of the Petrograd Trading Company is Abram Zhivatovsky, one of Trotsky's uncles, and Reilly is his representative in New York.
Right.
The thing that you tend to find among the Zhivatovsky circles is that almost all of the people who they do business with or place any kind of confidence in are related to them in some way.
Hmm.
They're people that they're either related to by marriage or they're cousins of one kind.
There's a Russian term for that.
Mishpoka.
Mishpucha.
Mishpoka, which is
Mishpucha.
it's probably Hebrew, but in one sense, it's sort of a circle of trust, that kind of idea. Mishpoka basically means family or close friends that are treated like family.
Hmm.
People that you place, people you can kind of trust.
Right. Yeah.
All right. And so that's what you have to become part of that. You're kind of brought into the inner circle, but you're never going to be trusted with money. Okay.
Right.
Abram Zhivatovsky was not a fool. And he became a successful businessman by not putting trust or money into the hands of people that he wasn't aware of. So the mere fact that he would engage Reilly as one of his main business representatives abroad would argue, doesn't prove, but it would argue that there was some familial connection between them. And then you get into other little things, like, for instance, Reilly's mother, if he mentions her, the name that usually comes up, her first name is Paulina. Last names will vary, but that comes up more than once. Someone will mention his mother's was Paulina.
Mm-hmm.
Then again, if you're reading through Trotsky's autobiography, you'll notice that one day he mentions that his mother, a Paulina, okay, a friend of hers by the name of Paulina, came to visit her. Doesn't say whether she's a cousin or whatever it was, but there's someone who was a Paulina that his mother is friends with.
Right.
And then at some point, also during World War I, Reilly ends up marrying this Russian woman, bigamously, by the way, whose maiden name was, well, her name is Nadezhda Massino. Kind of a weird name. It's actually Italian, but you know, get a lot of names in Russia. So she's originally from the Massino family. Well, then you find out that the Massinos are related to the Brodskys that are related to the Brods. So it's like she's also some sort of shirt tail relative in this.
Right.
So then the question, so you begin to see all these little things, that there are all these little threads, like these little photons that are going around, and they all tend to orbit around the Bronstein family and Trotsky's nexus of cousins, which makes me suspect that the real Reilly is related to that in some way. And I think later on, that's one of the things that he very much wanted to disguise. He did not want any kind of familial connection, Trotsky, to be known.
Right. That would definitely be something to be occulted for certain.
But he goes, I mean, I'm not sure that's all there is to it, but there is something to be. I mean, you find other things. There's another sort of spy from that period, and a kind of Russo-American spy with the interesting name of Xenophon Kalamatiano. And
fascinating.
So Xenophon Kalamatiano, you would get all these different versions about who his father was. And he would tell people different versions about it. So, you know, his father was a Russian Greek businessman who was killed in an accident, who was killed in a brawl, or died here, who died there, but you'd never get the same story. And I spent a lot of time trying to run down all these different versions. You know, even trying the version as to where Kalamatian himself was born, because sometimes he would say he was born in Vienna. In other cases, he would say he was born in Sevastopol. And then how he fit into this. Well, eventually got some, you know, a genealogical researcher in Russia to go through records, and I figured out what it was. And the key to it is that his mother's name is Kalamatiano.
Okay.
And his name is Kalamatiano. And the reason for that is that he has no legal father. He's illegitimate. His mother was a 16-year-old daughter of a noble family, the Kalamatianos, Greeks who had become Russianized back in the 18th century. And she'd gotten knocked up, and her family sent her off to Paris to give birth. And that's where he was born.
Wow.
And on the birth
That's
certificate,
fascinating.
there is no father's name listed. So then you get this kind of click. Then you realize what it was. Then the reason why Xenophon Kalamatiano had occulted his father, because he didn't know who his father was.
Right.
And that is always the answer. But where you find that there are these multiple inconsistent answers to it, it's because there is no answer.
Right.
And I don't know. I mean, maybe that's somewhere, maybe that's the whole thing with Reilly. Maybe he is sort of related to the Braunstein somewhere along the way, but basically he's a bastard.
Something socially embarrassing. I mean, particularly in that age.
Yeah.
Very disreputable, but he's part of the family in some way, so we'll use him. And
he's Paulina's kid, so we would have to accept him in that way. And it's there's this whole the whole matrilineal thing. People will generally accept. Somebody did some sort of study on that if there's an illegitimate child born to a woman in the family, they'll generally be accepted. On the other hand, if they're a male family member's child by a woman who isn't part of the family, they won't be.
Yeah, that does play out in history in many cultures. It's interesting. That is interesting, actually.
Well, it's always the same old story. Mama's baby, Papa's maybe.
Right.
So
this is true.
More often than people would like to think, but we do.
Which is something that people keep occulted for a very reason. It's interesting how childhood trauma and how the events of one's birthing and upbringing and one's familial context can have ramifications that just sort of rip off. I also find it interesting, something I noticed in the biographies of some historical spies. You do have this trope sometimes of illegitimate birth, bastardy, or orphanage, being an orphan.
Yeah.
And I can imagine people on the outskirts of accepted society, in order to find a role, they would have to develop certain skill sets, certain types of social skills that you wouldn't necessarily have to develop if you were just accepted right off the bat. And that could be very useful to people in power.
You have to become something. If you don't know who you are, I mean, think of if you grew up in an orphanage, you never really knew your parents. So you have no real idea where you come from.
Right.
You've never seen, there's the whole thing is that, among family members, your parent, I mean, usually, things biologically work out. You look at your parents and you can see part of yourself. You resemble people.
Right.
And that becomes a part of it, and as time goes on, as you get older, you realize you're a lot more like them than you wanted to imagine that you were, as their mannerisms begin to appear. It's like you wake up one morning and you become your dad.
Yes.
You didn't, you look like them and you begin to sound like them. But for someone who never has that, I mean, they have no reference point to it. There's no kind of benchmark. Then I would think that you'd be more inclined to invent something. You'd have to invent something to fill that void.
Yes.
Which could mean that if you're not really anybody, then you could sort of become anyone. You can make yourself whatever you might want to be. And that again could be one of those things that in Reilly's cases plays into it, that he could simply reinvent himself because he was never really anything to begin with. He never knew who he was. So he became this series of
Right.
different people.
And just becomes adept at flipping through self-invention and reinvention.
Yeah, it's a constant case of and also pretending to be things to various people that he met. I mean, his whole pretense that he was this grand crusader against Bolshevism, where at the same time he was not only had kinds of all sorts of personal and business associations with various representatives of the Soviet government.
Right.
And he was never what it was that he seemed to be.
Armand Hammer seems similar to me. Not exactly like there's a sense with Armand Hammer of you know who he is.
Yeah.
But there's something when I read about him, there seems to be something that's not protean, but he has this ability to kind of almost change form in a certain way. And I never feel certain of who I'm dealing with when I'm looking at Armand Hammer.
Well, his part of it, if you look at the roots, his father, Julius Hammer, was a long time, it was a Russian Jewish immigrant, radicalized very early, became a successful businessman, though. This is one of the things that I find is that there are a lot of Marxists who are really good business. They really are. Okay, they have a knack for this.
Yeah.
And so it's this kind of pattern. I mean, I think Trotsky would have done that. Trotsky could have been, he could have run a movie studio. You could have had, Metro Goodwin Braunstein, and he would have been, look, if you can build the Red Army out of nothing, you could build a company. It's the same sort of procedures that are used. Julius Hammer was a successful medical man, successful, but he was also a diehard communist. And he became one of the founding members of the Communist Party, and he raised his sons and sort of I'm not sure how much they ever sort of absorbed the ideological point to it, but the whole family basically ends up doing business as becoming these kind of Western commercial representatives of the Soviet regime in the early 20s.
Right.
So, Armand is sent over by his dad to run the family business there, and the Bolsheviks call him the capitalist prince. But he makes all kinds of deals between the different companies, and then he becomes a front man for selling, purloined artworks in the West. So, yes, Armand Hammer was a lifelong Soviet agent of influence.
Right.
But he mixed with very high levels in the West. I mean, look at who his friends were.
Yeah, he was like a veritable who's who of the business elite, social elite, the entertainment world. And I guess that thread continues with his grandson, Armand Hammer, who's a pretty cool actor. I like him.
Yeah, I mean,
for the roles he's played.
See, that's what money can do for you. That's what happens. And it's one of those things that you find, it's like F. Scott Fitzgerald, the rich are different from us. Because they are in a way, but you begin to move, and you're sort of seen for what you are. I mean, the whole point would be is that someone who is wealthy and who moves, let's say, in elite capitalist circles would never be taken as being a communist agent, would they?
No.
Therefore, they're perfect for the job. Okay. Whatever it is that you appear to that you could never be is what makes you the most qualified to do that job. So, I think Armand Hammer was basically just motivated by greed more than anything else.
Right.
But his father sort of pointed that way early on. He had one foot in Moscow and he had one foot in the West. And what you found was that the Soviets had lots of former religious or other art that they wanted. They needed hard currency, and they needed it bad because the ruble was worthless. But on the other hand, a Fabergé egg, there was always some sort of, there was some rich, greedy bloodsucker in the West, okay, who wanted to spend all the money he'd gotten from exploiting the workers
Right.
on a piece of Fabergé art, and we're going to sell it to him.
And we'll take that money and benefit the workers.
Right.
Yeah.
Or something.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or something. Well, I've kept you quite a bit.
Yeah, my wife just came a little bit ago and said she needed me to do something. So
would you be open to another conversation at
Sure.
your day kind
Sure.
of along these lines? Great.
yeah. Again, I'm probably in November
Okay.
when I get back. So
Okay.
maybe
That sounds
real
good.
soon. But yeah, no, this has been a
Yeah.
very interesting talk.
Yeah.
Hopefully your listeners, may they be many, will
Hopefully.
enjoy
Hopefully.
this as well.
Yeah. And if would you like to mention some more information about your great courses and where people could find them?
The great courses, well, you can Google the great courses, or they're also doing a kind of brand change. They're calling themselves Wondrium. So
Okay.
WONDRIUM, Wondrium. So great courses, Wondrium. You Google either one of those, and then what you would look for is the real history of secret societies
Mhm.
and crimes of the century.
All
And
right.
both of those are in different formats. You know, you can get them. Also, if you have Amazon Prime,
Mhm.
and you go to if you already have Amazon Prime, and you go there, if you look through it, there's a great courses signature collection, and Secret Societies is there. So it's like you already have it.
It's on
And I think
Amazon.
you would. And no, I don't cover every single secret society that has ever existed, because there are just too many of them. But what I do try to do in this is to take it, you know, so if we're going to talk about the Bavarian Illuminati, or God help us, the Freemasons, that I try to give you the straight story about, okay, this is what they are, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, this is all the crap that sort of connected it to it, and this is what you have.
Right.
And I don't belong to any of them. All right, so this is the important point. I am not now, nor have I ever been, the member of any secret society, not even the Boy Scouts.
I was a Boy Scout. Well, actually, I was a Cub Scout. I
Yeah,
couldn't make it up to Boy Scouts, but that's about it
Yeah.
for me. No,
I don't do
no
that
other
because
initiatives.
you join you join a hierarchical initiatory organization, and it's somebody telling you what to do.
Right.
And if there's one thing I've decided I don't like, it's other people telling me what to do,
Right.
which is why I'm retired.
And all the best to you on your retirement.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, it's been a wonderful conversation, and thank you so much for your time.
Well,
And,
thank you for having me, and I wish you the best of luck with this, and hopefully we'll talk again.
hopefully soon.
All right. Thanks a
Have a
lot.
great night.
You too.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.